right. Well, thank you, Mike. It's a pleasure to be here and speak with this group. My name is Dwight Hughes. I specialize in Civil War and naval history. I've got 3 books out now, and I'm a contributing author to the Emerging Civil War blog. Today, we're going to talk about the naval Civil War in theaters near and far. In his classic treatise on war, Karl von Clausewitz discussed factors of space, mass, and time related to battle, one of which is the theater of operations, which he defined as a sector of the total war area which has protected boundaries and so a certain degree of independence. Protected boundaries might consist of fortifications, natural barriers, or simply distance. A theater is a subordinate entity in itself, depending on the extent to which changes occurring elsewhere in the war area affect it not directly, but only indirectly. Combat theaters of the Civil War are identified as the Eastern, the Western, and the Trans-Mississippi. Although it was principally a land conflict, naval operations were central to that momentous struggle. The naval war also can be defined as distinct zones of activity which warrant independent consideration, as the offshore blockade, littoral coasts and harbors, heartland rivers, and the wide oceans. Some of these wet theaters overlap terrestrial counterparts and extended into the continental core, while others stretched beyond familiar battlefields to the far side of the world. Naval areas of operation each exhibited unique characteristics and posed exceptional challenges to the United States and Confederate States navies and to their command authorities. We will overview similarities and differences among the naval theaters in strategy, tactics, technology, and joint operations. As war commenced in 1861, General-in-Chief Winfield Scott advised the new president to surround and strangle the rebellious states, a strategy that became known as the Anaconda Plan. 1 week after the fall of Fort Sumter, President Lincoln issued an emergency executive proclamation implementing a seaborne blockade of the Confederacy. The blockade constituted a discrete naval zone of operations with monumental challenges over 3,500 miles of Atlantic and Gulf coast, from the surf out to several miles seaward. It became the primary mission of the United States Navy. Previous blockades, most recently Great Britain's enormous effort during the French Wars, were defensive. They concentrated on confining enemy naval forces in key ports to maintain command of the sea and to prevent enemy invasions. Disruption of the adversary's seaborne commerce was a secondary consideration. President Lincoln and Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles, however, would attempt an offensive blockade to suppress ingress and egress of countless trading vessels of all nations to and from estuaries, bays, harbors, and streams. It would be the largest, the longest, and the most expensive military campaign of the war, viewed by many as impossible. But to even do that, Welles needed ships, and lots of them. The U.S. Navy underwent a technological revolution in the 1850s. Congress authorized the Merrimack class of 6 large, steam-powered, propeller-driven frigates, along with 5 Hartford-class steam sloops. These warships compared favorably to potential European opponents. By 1859, the Navy added 24 major new combatants, all of them steamers, and all armed with the most sophisticated naval ordnance. But they would be far from sufficient to meet the emergency. The first U.S. ironclads were designed more to counter the perceived threat of British intervention than anything Confederates could produce. The ironclad frigate New Ironsides would support the blockade and coastal operations. The ironclad sloop Galena was a total failure. Advances in metallurgy and casting techniques enabled ever bigger naval artillery. Rifled bores and explosive shells were improving rapidly. The standard naval cannon was the 9-inch Dahlgren smoothbore, capable of firing shot and shell. 11 and 15-inch Dahlgrens and other models were deployed also. Warship ordnance had vastly increased range, accuracy, and destructive power over the predecessors, including, for the first time in history, the ability to compete with shore batteries in range and weight of metal. Secretary Wells undertook an immense, unparalleled warship procurement program, arming almost anything that could float, including tugs, ferries, and merchant vessels of all sizes and shapes. An eclectic mix of frigates, sloops, and converted merchantmen, side wheel and screw, sail and steam of all sizes and shapes would be employed in multiple combinations and numbers throughout the war. The fleet surged from a third-rate force of less than 100 ships to over 600 war vessels. The Navy designed and constructed new warship classes to novel designs. For example, the 23 Unadilla-class gunboats, also known as 90-day gunboats for their rapid construction, were large enough for the ocean, yet light enough for inshore work. 23 were built, primarily to chase blockade runners, of which they destroyed no less than 146. They also participated in shore raids and invasions, bombardments, and engagements with enemy land or naval forces. Although sources vary as to their performance and reliability, the Unadilla gunboats accumulated an impressive combat record. Steam propulsion enabled blockaders to maintain station off rebel ports much more consistently than wind ships, but they also presented new difficulties in ship maintenance and fuel supply. The Navy developed innovative steam tactics for barriers afloat, a new operational unit, the squadron, led by a newly established rank of admiral and involving masses of ships from dozens to hundreds, presented additional challenges in command and control, signaling, and seamanship. Steam also furnished the rebels a new class of sleek, fast blockade runners, which frequently outran and outmaneuvered their pursuers. Thousands of storm-tossed and bored blockaders on hundreds of vessels surveilled undifferentiated sand dunes and swamps from the Chesapeake Bay to the Rio Grande, while infrequently bursting into frenetic action for a few shots at a speeding rebel runner. Many got through, but a significant number did not. Although quantitative conclusions are elusive, the blockade progressively constricted the Southern economy, crippled its military industries, deprived its citizens, and degraded home front morale. Turning to the littoral theater, this zone of operations overlapped land and sea at the edge of the continent, beginning at the surf line, but extending inland along the Atlantic and Gulf coasts to encompass beaches, estuaries, deltas, bays, and harbors. Operations were principally an extension of the blockade and conducted by the same Union squadrons. But as in the blockade, they presented unprecedented obstacles. They produced novel strategies, innovative tactics, and emerging technology. The initial strategy in 1861 was modest: stop the privateers and seize coaling stations for blockaders. Steam propulsion and heavy naval armament would be applied, with novel line-ahead racetrack formations to reduce shore fortifications. The first assault on a hostile coast closed the gap in the barrier islands at Hatteras Inlet, through which rebel privateers were attacking Union commerce. The next operation was to seize a coaling base for blockaders at Port Royal Sound, located halfway between Charleston and Savannah. On November 7th, Flag Officer Samuel F. DuPont led a column of 9 warships into the harbor at Port Royal. The squadron pounded 2 incomplete and lightly armed earth and log forts into surrender, and accompanying Army units took possession. Naval dogma for centuries had held, with good reason, that fragile wooden warships dependent on wind could not take on shore fortifications with heavier guns on stable platforms behind stout walls. Now, apparently, these modern, larger, and stouter vessels, propelled by steam, could. DuPont employed a simple but revolutionary tactic, impossible with wind ships. Rather than anchoring off the beach as static gun platforms to engage the forts, he kept his ships in line and steaming in a loop between rebel forts on either side. Rebel gunners struggled to hit moving targets, while shipboard gunners fired successive broadsides as targets swept by their muzzles. Hatteras Inlet and Port Royal Sound had been Navy victories, with the Army in a secondary role. But Port Royal presented a missed strategic opportunity for joint operations. Flag Officer DuPont understood that the Sound had potential beyond serving as a blockading base. This wonderful sheet of water, he wrote, was like driving a wedge between Savannah and Charleston. General R.E. Lee was overseeing coastal defenses. He predicted that the enemy would seize the railroad between the cities, sever communications, and then envelop both cities by land and sea. This would be a difficult combination for us successfully to resist. But Union leaders were focused on Richmond and did not see the possibilities. There would be limited joint operations in Port Royal then or later. What if? The Navy's littoral mission expanded dramatically in 1862 to secure coastal enclaves and a major port, support land campaigns, reinforce the blockade, and disrupt coastal trade. All of these were unfamiliar, uncertain, and ad hoc learn-as-you-go operations. The new technology was ironclads. The first major joint campaign succeeded, and the Navy learned to bypass and neutralize powerful forts in narrow channels. The campaign to capture the North Carolina Sounds began with an amphibious operation at Roanoke Island. In Hampton Roads, the Navy supported General McClellan's Peninsula campaign, including extensive shore bombardment, fought the first battle of the ironclads, helped the Navy recapture Gosport Navy Yard, and dominated water approaches to Richmond for the remainder of the war. The next month saw the capture of the South's largest port at New Orleans, and the Confederates also abandoned Pensacola. Over the winter of 1861-62, General Ambrose Burnside formed what he called a coast division of 15,000 men. Supported by water transportation and the Navy, the division, noted Burnside, could be rapidly thrown from point to point on the coast. It could land troops, establish lodgements, capture strategic points, penetrate the interior, disrupt communications, and dominate inland waterways. Flag Officer Lewis M. Goldsboro was tasked to support Burnside. Together, they scraped together a motley fleet of over 80 light draft civilian vessels, just the leavings from the blockade. These included coastal and river craft, steam and sail, barges, tugs, and ferries to transport 15,000 troops with their weapons, baggage, and camp equipage and rations. Many of these vessels were strengthened to mount a few guns with sandbags and hay bales stacked around the decks for protection. No fleet units were assigned. But the service had no common commander below the commander-in-chief and no common staff. They were separate arms operating in distinct domains, often competitors for public funding and attention. No officer of either branch could issue an order to an officer of the other, respective rank notwithstanding. No protocols or mechanisms existed for joint operations. Cooperation at the operational level was ad hoc, depended entirely on the personalities of field commanders, their abilities to develop a common plan and then to execute it. Service rivalry and lack of joint perspective impeded many operations and negated strategic opportunities. Burnside and Goldsboro, however, set the example. Together, they effectively executed combined arms offensive operations. The Coast Division was the first dedicated, rapid deployment joint amphibious force. The general and the flag officer set off to take control of the North Carolina Sounds. The first objective was Roanoke Island. Then they conducted a series of landings, ending at Beaufort and Fort Macon. Burnside occupied Goldsboro and cut the railroad between Wilmington and Richmond, but only briefly. At Roanoke Island, Burnside and Goldsboro executed a textbook amphibious assault with no textbook. Transports disgorged soldiers into surf boats, which were towed shoreward in long lines by light draft steamers, and then cast off to row ashore. In just a few hours, the entire 15,000-man force was landed. Union gunboats softened up the landing, suppressed shore batteries, and fired a rolling barrage as blue coats surged up the island to bag the forts with the entire garrison. One historian noted that this was as neat a combined operation as any executed during the entire war. Another called it an excellent example of how the absence of traditional command structure and doctrine can be overcome by unity of effort and innovative thinking. Roanoke Island set the example for joint operations, later followed on the Mississippi by General Grant and Admiral Porter. Goldsboro's little navy sank or ran off of the few rebel gunboats called the Mosquito Fleet at Elizabeth City. Additional thrusts to the state capital at Raleigh and even south to Wilmington were considered, but in June, Burnside's forces were recalled to support George McClellan's flailing campaign against Richmond. The Coast Division was absorbed into the Army of the Potomac. The Union would dominate the Sounds for the remainder of the war. Predations on Union shipping were stopped. Enemy waterborne trade routes were severed, constricting the movement of supplies to northern Virginia. But once again, no follow-up joint operations were considered. The Wilmington and Weldon Railroad, called the lifeline of the Confederacy, kept the Army of Northern Virginia going for 3 more years. Once again, what if? A few weeks later at New Orleans, Flag Officer David G. Farragut steamed 17 sloops and gunboats up the river channel, bypassing 2 forts. Both contestants mounted around 170 guns each. Farragut pushed aside a few rebel gunboats and encountered no torpedoes. Stout steam warships with heavy artillery could now penetrate a narrow channel defended by powerful masonry forts. Technology had evened the odds between ship and shore. Efforts continued to capture remaining rebel ports and stop blockade running by bypassing and neutralizing additional forts and putting troops ashore. The newest tactic was executing a massed ironclad attack against forts at Charleston Harbor. Farragut repeated his New Orleans success at Mobile Bay, which, along with the capture of Atlanta, propelled President Lincoln into his second term. In January 1865, the climatic amphibious landing took Fort Fisher and Wilmington. Samuel F. DuPont, wearing the newly created rank of admiral, commanded the attack on Charleston Harbor with a squadron of 7 Passaic-class monitors, along with the ironclad frigate New Ironsides, and an experimental ironclad named Keokuk. Secretary Welles harbored inflated expectations for these monitors, fully anticipating a replication of Farragut's victory at New Orleans. But DuPont's ironclad column became mired in a torpedo field and shallow water. Pounded mercilessly for 2 hours, they retreated with severe damage. The Keokuk was sunk. Unlike the Mississippi at New Orleans, Charleston Harbor was a cul-de-sac, surrounded by forts and batteries with hundreds of heavy guns. The Monitor ironclads mounted a total of 34 guns. However well protected, with their slow rate of fire, monitors were not effective against fortifications. The birthplace of the rebellion would not be conquered from the sea. The climactic naval and joint campaign captured Fort Fisher, guarding the last blockade-running port of Wilmington. It began with an amphibious landing, accompanied by a massive shore bombardment. Then, a Marine brigade assault on the northeast bastion, and finally, the Army assault on the river gate. Constructed mostly of earth and sand, Fort Fisher absorbed heavy fire better than the older mortar and brick fortifications. The fort mounted 47 guns. Admiral David D. Porter stationed 40 warships with more than 600 guns on the firing line. Although accuracy was poor and visibility restricted, the naval bombardment encouraged the Confederates to abandon their outer defenses and destroyed or dismounted many rebel guns, thereby weakening the defenses and facilitating the fort's capture. Porter organized a landing force of 1,600 sailors and 400 Marines, led by Lieutenant Commander Kidder Breese, to attack the fort's sea face. Armed only with revolvers and cutlasses, the sailors were attacked in waves, while the Marines with muskets provided covering fire. Instead, the whole force surged forward in an unorganized mass, only to be routed with heavy casualties. Of 2,000 sailors and Marines, no more than 200 made it to the walls. The attack, however, drew Confederate attention away from the river gate, where troops launched the attack that finally took the citadel. The grueling battle lasted for hours. Long after dark, as shells plunged in from the sea, 16 U.S. sailors were awarded the Medal of Honor for gallantry. Moving to the river theater, maritime mobility and firepower converged most thoroughly with land power in the heartland, where riverine warfare was invented. The campaign for the lower Mississippi and its tributaries, the spine of America, extended over 1,000 twisting river miles, double what the crow could fly, from Cairo, Illinois to New Orleans, cutting through 6 states in a massive alluvial floodplain averaging 75 miles wide, the best cotton land in the world. I think the Mississippi, the great artery of America. Whatever power holds it, holds the continent, wrote General William Tecumseh Sherman. General Winfield Scott's Anaconda Plan called for a powerful movement down the Mississippi to the ocean, with a cordon of posts captured at proper points. He suggested in 1861 12 to 20 steam gunboats, some 40 transports, and 80,000 men. Troops should receive at least 4.5 months of training to be fielded by November 1861. That was too slow for most people in 1861, but it was close to what actually happened. In just half a century, steam propulsion revolutionized river commerce. Despite differing political interests, the rivers constituted a vigorous economic unity with a huge market linking rural southern communities with northern urban centers. Cotton, molasses, sugar, and coffee poured up and down the Mississippi. Southbound steamers were stacked with northern dry goods, grain, lumber, and merchandise. In both directions, passengers thronged the decks. The war would halt much of this traffic. The deep water United States Navy had no experience managing shallow draft, broad beam vessels along swift and meandering channels with shifting mud and sandbanks, littered with wrecks and snags, and subject to dramatic changes in depth, direction, current, and weather. Ocean sailors avoided such conditions. Civilian river pilots, however, were a different breed. They would be hired or enlisted for river warships. The Army wished to assemble a Western gunboat flotilla at Cairo to defend the Ohio and Upper Mississippi along the water boundary between North and South. But they had never conducted large river operations either. They had no shallow water gunships, no command structure, no infrastructure, and no tactics. Navy Secretary Wells was asked to assist. He, however, was concentrated wholly on the blockade. His Navy was not trained, equipped, or funded for brown water, and he had no resources to spare. Wells initially would send just a few officers whose role was solely to aid, advise, and cooperate with the Army in crossing or navigating the rivers or in arming and equipping the boats required. It was up to the Army to fund, build, or acquire, man, equip, operate, and maintain river gunboats. Cairo would become the first inland naval base. In tactics and technology, however, riverine warfare was a wholly new concept. History offers few examples of extensive operations involving specialized classes of war vessels, officered and manned by naval personnel cooperating with land forces. Emergent technologies of steam propulsion, ion armor, and heavy naval artillery were untested in river combat. In May 1861, Secretary Wells sent Commander John Rogers to advise Major General George B. McClellan, who was then commanding the Department of the Ohio. By placing naval officers subordinate to an Army general, Wells unintentionally created the concept of a joint service command. Rogers purchased 3 commercial paddle steamers in Cincinnati and contracted for their hurried conversion. Boilers and steam pipes were lowered from the main deck into the hold. The high superstructures were removed and replaced with 5-inch thick oak bulwarks for small arms protection. Sides were pierced and decks strengthened for 6 or 8 guns. The timberclads, Tyler, Conestoga, and Lexington, were the first commissioned United States warships dedicated to river conflict. Naval officers commanded them, with crews recruited from rivermen, local landsmen, and the Army. Escaped slaves constituted a significant portion of the crew. The timberclads would serve valiantly in every river campaign. The next step was to design and build gunboats from the keel up, producing the first uniform class of river war vessels and the first U.S. ironclads to enter combat. James Buchanan Eads, a wealthy St. Louis industrialist and self-taught naval engineer, obtained an Army contract and risked his fortune to fund the venture. Eads was an exceptional river navigator and would become a world-renowned civil engineer and inventor. Noted naval architect Samuel M. Pooke designed these unprecedented vessels with shallow, broad, wooden river hulls, armored decks, and an armored casemate mounting 13 to 16 guns, and a steam engine driving a covered paddle wheel. Named after river cities, they were called city-class ironclads, Eads gunboats, or Pooke turtles. They integrated firepower, protection, and mobility in an unprecedented manner, but they were not perfect. The armor was suboptimal. Maneuverability was restricted. They had no watertight compartments to isolate flooding. They were vulnerable to torpedoes, which would sink two of them, and to ramming, which would briefly sink two others. However, the city-class ironclads became the backbone of the river flotilla. In addition, hundreds of unarmed transports and lightly armored tinclads supported the armies. The Mississippi boats were admirably calculated for handling troops, horses, guns, stores, etc., easy of embarkation and disembarkation, and supplies of all kinds were abundant, noted General Sherman. From his first battle at Belmont, Missouri, General Ulysses S. Grant, with the full cooperation of naval commanders, instinctively integrated maritime forces as combined arms elements, despite the total lack of joint operating procedures. Commanded by Flag Officer Andrew H. Foote, the river ironclads bombarded and captured their first fort for Fort Henry on the Tennessee River, and assisted Grant's capture of Fort Donelson on the Cumberland. It was the Union's first major victory. The ironclads, however, suffered severe damage and casualties in the process. As the entire Confederate defensive line in the West collapsed, the Navy transported Grant and his army deep into enemy territory for the Battle of Shiloh. Timberclads Tyler and Lexington provided heavy artillery support from the river. While the battle raged at Shiloh, Flag Officer Foote proceeded downriver and introduced a new and previously unthinkable tactic at Island Number 10. He would be the first to run vulnerable gunboats through a narrow channel past powerful shore fortifications, and then insert a conquering army in the rear to capture the enemy fortress. Once again, steam, iron, and bigger naval guns evened the odds between ship and shore. It would be a precedent for victories at New Orleans, Vicksburg, Port Hudson, and Mobile. Flag Officer Charles H. Davis relieved Foote in command of the Western gunboat flotilla. At Plum Point above Memphis on May 10th, rebel gunboats rammed and sank two of his ironclads, although they were quickly raised and returned to service. And then he steamed on downriver for Memphis. Hundreds of Memphis citizens assembled on the bluffs to observe the only fleet action on the rivers. The Confederate River Defense Fleet was a motley collection of 8 riverboats, hastily converted for ramming, with reinforced bows and 1 or 2 light guns. Union ironclads steamed around the bend, accompanied by the peculiar United States ram fleet. noted civil engineer and riverman Charles Ellet Jr. persuaded Secretary of War Stanton to appoint him a colonel of engineers with authority to build his own flotilla, manned by civilian rivermen. Ellet reinforced several powerful river towboats as rams, but with no guns. He reported only to Stanton and only voluntarily cooperated with naval and army field commanders. As Flag Officer Davis and his ironclads opened fire at long range, Ellet's rams charged in without notice. A raging melee erupted with no coordination on either side. Union and rebel rams collided in a mass tangle. The rebel squadron was destroyed, marking the near eradication of Confederate naval presence on the river. This was the last engagement in which ramming was a primary tactic, and the last time civilians commanded ships in combat. The loss of the Confederacy's fifth largest city and key industrial center opened the Mississippi all the way to Vicksburg and opened West Tennessee to Union occupation. Following Memphis, Secretary Wells in the Navy took full ownership of the gunboat flotilla from the Army, redesignating it the Mississippi River Squadron, equal in command seniority to the blockading squadrons, and finally, a true brown water Navy. Rear Admiral David D. Porter took command and headed south towards the keystone of rebel defenses of the mighty river, Vicksburg, Mississippi. Porter teamed with General Grant and his Army of the Tennessee. Grant treated Porter as a senior combat arms commander, while Porter instructed his officers to obey Grant's orders as if they were his, subordinating the Navy command to the general's operational direction. One historian noted that Grant and Porter were a formidable combination, hyper-aggressive and strategically astute. One was a ground commander with an inborn understanding of topography, and the other a river warrior, masterful at using enemy waters to his advantage. Together, they formed one of the most potent partnerships of the war and invented river warfare on the fly. In December 1862, Grant planned a two-pronged assault on Vicksburg. He marched his main force south down the railroad and sent General William T. Sherman with 32,000 troops on transports down the Mississippi, accompanied by Porter and his gunboats. But rebel cavalry got in Grant's rear, cut the railroad, and destroyed supply depots. He was compelled to turn back. Sherman landed at Chickasaw Bayou on the Yazoo River. What followed was the disastrous Battle of Chickasaw Bayou, in which Sherman's four divisions suffered bloody repulse against formidable defenses in rain-soaked swamps. But as the first major amphibious landing on the rivers, the operation was wholly successful. Overseeing 7 gunboats and 59 transports, Porter delivered Sherman's 32,000 men to the riverbanks, covered their landing, suppressed enemy batteries and troop concentrations, and then neatly extracted the Union forces when the odds turned. The City-class ironclad Cairo struck a mine and sank in 12 minutes. Her remains were raised in the 1960s and are on display today at Vicksburg. The admiral and the general made additional attempts to get at the city from north, notably the Yazoo Pass and Steele's Bayou expeditions. Troops blew up river levees, flooding the Mississippi Delta cottonland. The Navy ran ironclad and wooden gunboats and troop transports through sluggish swamps and antediluvian forests and along narrow twisting canals flanked by high banks. In these operations, noted Porter, I have to say that we failed most egregiously. To the astonishment of slaves lining the banks, Porter's boats rammed over ancient trees and knock canal bridges into kindling. A multitude of vermin would be shaken out on the deck, wrote the admiral, including rats, raccoons, mice, cockroaches, snakes, and lizards, to be swept overboard by sailors with brooms. Meanwhile, the Confederates deployed sharpshooters and field pieces and set up ad hoc batteries. They chopped down huge trees both in front and behind the slow-moving columns in the narrow channels. Harassed from ambush, unable to move forward, and almost trapped, the columns had to turn back. These were, recalled the admiral, the most remarkable military and naval expeditions ever set out in any country. And they might have succeeded, much to the Navy's credit, but now are largely forgotten. So Grant decided on a highly risky plan to march his army down through the swamps of the West Bank, cutting his supply lines from the north. He asked Porter to run gunboats and empty transports by the Vicksburg batteries, get the army across the river below the city so he could approach from the south and east. Sherman thought it would be a debacle. Porter was dubious, informing the general that he might get downriver, but it would be suicide to steam back up through the guns against the current. The Army and the Navy could be stuck downriver without supplies. But Sherman and Porter would do their best. On a clear night with no moon, 7 gunboats and 3 transports got underway, with Porter in the lead boat. Every fort and hilltop vomited forth shot and shell, recalled Porter. On April 22nd, 6 more boats loaded with supplies made the run. Only 2 transports were lost, 13 men wounded and none killed. Porter secured both banks below the city, ferried the army over, and took station to besiege Vicksburg from the river, while Grant headed into the country to surround and finally capture the Gibraltar of the West. It would be arguably the most brilliant and strategically impactful campaign of the war. For 2 more years, the Mississippi River Squadron fought guerrillas, supported occupation forces, interdicted enemy trade, and defended friendly commerce. Although the final naval campaign on the Red River in 1864 was both dramatic and futile. However, water and land services meshed most effectively for the Union in the heartland, conducting a type of warfare not seen again until Vietnam. Grant would write of the Vicksburg campaign. The Navy under Porter was all it could be. Without its assistance, the campaign could not have been successfully made. The most perfect harmony reigned between the 2 arms of the services. And finally, out to the oceans. Commander James D. Bullock was the chief Confederate naval agent in Europe. He recalled their efforts to organize the naval force abroad, noting that a few armed cruisers destroyed many American ships and well nigh drove the American commercial flag from the high seas. Commerce destruction is an ancient form of naval warfare favored by weaker contestants. This asymmetric strategy targeted the opponent's economy, the home front morale, and the will to fight. Confederate Navy Secretary Stephen Mallory wrote, "The enemy's commerce constitutes one of his reliable sources of national wealth, no less than one of his best schools for seamen, and we must strike it if possible." Rebel raiders operated primarily in the North Atlantic, although the CSS Alabama rambled as far as the South China Sea. Union Navy Secretary Wells focused his resources on the blockade, reluctantly dispatching a few warships to chase them down, usually too little, too late. The last Confederate raider, CSS Shenandoah, circumnavigated the globe, decimated the North Pacific whaling fleet 6 weeks after Appomattox, and lowered the last Confederate banner in Liverpool on 6 November 1865. International agreements had outlawed the ancient practice of privateering. Secretary Mallory, therefore, championed an unprecedented class of state-commissioned and Navy-commanded warships dedicated solely to commerce destruction. They would be small, swift, lightly armed cruisers, combining fast sail with steam, sustainable for long cruises against a merchant fleet mostly still under canvas. The most productive rebel raiders, the Alabama and the Florida, were purpose-built to naval standards in Liverpool. They could catch most victims and avoid combat by outrunning most warships. A tactical superiority comparable to submarines of the next century. Secretary Mallory instructed his captains to do the enemy's property the greatest injury in the shortest time. The third best cruiser, Shenandoah, was an elegant British tea-clipper constructed in Glasgow with an auxiliary steam engine and a few guns. The epitome of the ancient art of tall ship construction and an excellent exemplar of the machine age. She carried a cloud of canvas, having crossjack, royal studding sails, jib topsail, and all the high flyers, wrote Commander Bullock. Other merchantmen converted for commerce destruction, however, were less successful. 8 Confederate commerce cruisers caught over 240 merchant ships, around 100,000 tons, worth 17 million 19th century dollars. Marine insurance rates soared. Owners held their vessels in port, and foreign contracts dried up. Ship owners sold another 1,000 vessels, 800,000 tons, into foreign ocean ownership to sail under a neutral flag. This was called the flight from the flag. Influential Yankee shipping and whaling interests put enormous pressure on the Lincoln administration to secure peace at any cost. The U.S. Merchant Service did not recover for decades, if ever. Commerce warfare was arguably the Confederacy's most effective military campaign, considering cost versus results. It exacerbated anti-war fatigue and caused severe political difficulties for the Lincoln administration. Despite the losses and panic in the North, however, the cruisers put not a dent in the Yankee war machine, nor in the flourishing trade that supported it. Commerce just shifted to neutral vessels, mostly British. And that's a look at the naval theaters of the Civil War. Thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions.